So I briefly thought that this might offer an explanation that the physical reservoirs of oil, the known giant fields and so forth, were actually beginning to decline their production rates. Then the more I investigated, I went to conferences where prominent spokesmen for the peak oil theory were present and giving their arguments, and what I found was that all of their arguments were based on oil being a fossil fuel. And then some scientists, friends of mine, sent me certain scientific papers that had been generated out of Russian scientific circles during the Cold War, and they presented an entirely different theory of the origins, the genesis of hydrocarbons, not just oil. Hydrocarbons include oil, gas, coal, tar sands, shale gas, shale oil, and so forth. So it's a quite large spectrum. The Russians were given the order back in the 1950s to come up with a solution to make Russia, or the Soviet Union, energy independent from the West, because Stalin at that time saw that this was going to be a very challenging thing to maintain Soviet independence in the face of the creation of NATO and so forth after 1948. So they looked at the origins of petroleum in a rigorous scientific way, and they looked at the literature in Western geological textbooks and so forth, and they found nowhere rigorous scientific proof of the genesis of hydrocarbons, the genesis of oil and gas. It was postulated as simply a gospel truth, like the virgin birth perhaps, a gospel truth in American universities and British universities, and then by extension throughout the Western world, that oil was a fossil fuel that somehow originated from dead dinosaur detritus, that somehow in some cases magically managed to find its way 20 kilometers under the surface of the earth to create pools of hydrocarbons. The more the Russians looked at that, the more they said this is patently absurd. This theory of fossil or biological origins of so much petroleum, so much, and the fossil crowd also claims coal, because it's also a hydrocarbon. It's another form of hydrocarbon. Well, the irony is, during the Cold War, and I have this from the Russians themselves, during the Cold War, the Soviet bureaucracy at the highest levels feared for their job, and they didn't dare trust a new theory, which this was. This was a revolution in geophysical thinking, the idea that oil is generated. Let me say a word about the genesis of oil that they discovered. Oil is generated deep in the core of the earth. It's a gigantic oven, if you want to imagine it, and through the enormous temperature and pressure, it's forced up through the granite mantle, which is the next layer going upward from the core out like a giant golf ball. It goes through fissures or small cracks in the mantle, and because of the force of energy, it tends to go in a straight line as efficiently as possible toward the surface of the earth until it meets a trap rock or a reservoir where its upward journey is hindered, and there it accumulates as reservoirs of oil or gas. The interesting thing that the Russians discovered is every giant oil field in the world, every giant oil field without exception, is a self-replenishing field, because this oven, the core of the earth, is always on. You don't turn it off. So the oil is being constantly generated, the gas is being constantly generated. We're not running out of oil, ironically, we're running into oil any place basically that we look for it. Offshore Brazil, the Mediterranean now is one of the hottest natural gas plays in the entire world, and it's changing the geopolitics of the Middle East.
Yeah. Can you tell our viewers some names of Russian scientists so that they are able to take a look at those scientific work?
Well, a lot of their papers have been printed by peer-reviewed scientific journals in the States and elsewhere. if people go to my book, Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars, I have a detailed bibliography of the most serious scientific papers, I think 10 or 15 papers, and that'll give ample evidence. And the experiments have been repeated in the laboratory under pressure and temperature conditions, which never has been done with so-called fossil fuel. You've never taken a dead dinosaur or a dead anything, or a dead plant, algae, and transformed it under temperature and pressure into a hydrocarbon. That hasn't been done because it can't be done. So the experiments, even the Carnegie Institution in Washington has conducted an experiment, and the Russians were invited in to consult on that because Carnegie didn't know quite what they were doing. So this is established. This is no theory anymore. This is established. The trick of the thing, and this I know from long discussions with the Russian scientists involved, the trick of the thing is to know where those migration channels lie. For example, the explosion, the sinking of the entire huge platform in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean, several years ago from BP, took place because unknowingly, in their greed to drill alone without a partner and discover another huge oil find, because they discovered one 7 miles away a couple years before, they, without knowing it, tapped into one of these migration channels, and the force of that explosion, because they hit, the source of this tremendous pressure coming from deep within, literally blew this platform out of the universe.